BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And just a quick reminder, every Monday is Zodiac Mondays. Wednesday is an Ask Me Anything. That's an AMA, so please drop your questions below for things that you would like discussed here on the show. And Friday is an Anything Goes. Any subject is fair game, mostly talking about true crime, serial killers, the Zodiac Killer, but any subject is welcome. All right, so please share some ideas in the comment section about what you would like to hear about on this channel, and let's get started. Okay, hello everybody. Today's Thursday, and welcome to the first episode in the Versus series. In some of the previous episodes here on this channel, Black Box Online Radio, I was asking you guys what you wanted to hear about, whether it was D.B. Cooper, Jack the Ripper, the Long Island serial killer, or just a general discussion about serial killers. And normally when I do those type of polling questions, I just count the number of comments that people leave for subject A or subject B, C, and D, and so on. But as I said in the most recent episode on last Thursday, I had to give a winning award to one of the comments, and it came from Studio Steph, who said the Long Island serial killer and other lesser-known serial killers, and that gave me the idea for the Versus series. And anyone who's listening to these as they come out in the playlist, you should be listening to this one right after the episode on the Zodiac Killer versus Jack the Ripper. And I began to notice a lot of similarities and differences with the Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper, and I did an episode about it for the Zodiac Mondays segment last spring. And if you haven't heard that one and you're listening to these as a standalone, I invite you to check that out. And I believe through this concept of comparing and contrasting, we will actually gain a greater understanding of these unsolved cases. And when it comes to any future episode dealing with a serial killer who has been identified, then it's just a greater understanding of humanity, learning more about how life happens, about how people operate. And I mean that with all sincerity for the following reason. When it comes to a serial killer who has been identified, whether it's the Golden State Killer or the Green River Killer, or maybe even some of the more famous ones like John Wayne Gacy or Jeffrey Dahmer, if they've been identified, then we can make much more definitive statements. We can make many more definitive statements about their psychology, who they were as a person, how they behaved, what elements drove them to become a serial killer. And on this channel, I suppose that we use the definition of a serial killer as someone who commits multiple murders with some type of cooling off period. There's a period in between the murders, and murder has to be the primary objective. For example, a drug dealer might murder multiple people throughout the course of his criminal activities, but murder isn't the primary objective. It is to sell drugs, and it's done for profit. The same with any type of person who's committing like a large string of robberies and that people get killed in the crossfire. If the primary objective is money, then that really isn't a serial killer, at least for the definition that we are using on this channel. Some would argue yes, and some would argue no. Perhaps we could do an entire episode about that for the Versus series. But now is a great time to like and subscribe so you can follow along with all of these true crime discussions. And please look out for some future things on the channel, as well as some of the other projects I work with on YouTube. I am also the host of a program called AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, the channel of just that name. And this year I did a 12-part series on astrology, just talking about the star signs. Even though I'm very skeptical, I wanted to share my genuine observations about astrology. I got on that subject because I do the Zodiac Monday segment here on Black Box Online Radio, and I wanted to talk about something a little bit lighter, but still very, very important for the, the greater understanding of humanity. It was Howard Stern, of all people, who said, the most fascinating subject out there is dissecting the everyday, ordinary individual and trying to learn how he or she thinks. And I did a lot of that on AstroPsych 400. And for anyone who does subscribe to that channel, the podcast for sleep is coming back. I did one episode on this channel here, Black Box Online Radio, called A Podcast for Sleep. It was because several people in the comments section said they like to listen to Black Box Online Radio when they're falling asleep at night, and I thought, well, why not make an episode purely customized for falling asleep? And I did the sleep podcast, and I asked somebody, do you think it's too different than the true crime material that I've been doing on Black Box Online Radio? And that person said yes. So that gave me the idea, why don't I just move it over to Astro Psych 400? And in the new year, it's now December at the time of this recording, I'm going to be doing more episodes at least once a week, I guess, putting out that podcast for sleep on Astro Psych 400. So please subscribe to Black Box Online Radio, Astro Psych 400, and of course the Zodiac Killer channel. We're going to be doing some more content in the future over there. The interviews with the expert series where I talk to many different Zodiac Killer researchers, including Michael Butterfield, Mark Hewitt, Drew Beeson, Michael Cole, many great interviews over there, and I invite you to like and subscribe on that channel as well. And another great way to support Black Box Online Radio, in addition to just listening, is to go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, fictional, but inspired by the Zodiac-Manson connection. However, the story is purely made up, a fictitious creation, if you will, and there is always the Teespring page. Feel free to have a look at some of the merchandise, and remember, being weird is not a crime. For today's episode, I know I said I was going to talk about some lesser-known serial killers, and that'll happen in the near future. I don't think either Jack the Ripper or the Long Island serial killer are lesser-known. However, in the polling comments, I noticed a lot of people said that I should do a series on the Long Island serial killer because there really weren't that many YouTube videos out there on the subject, and I mean, I've watched many of them, but they thought that not many YouTubers had responded to the coverage about the Long Island serial killer. I've done several episodes on the LISC, if you will, and I found that there are lots of websites and there's lots of reading material available online outside of YouTube, but Jack the Ripper is a serial killer that needs no introduction, and this versus series, this comparing and contrasting, it's all going to be blended together, interwoven, if you will. So the first point is that the time frames of these two individuals, the Long Island serial killer and Jack the Ripper, is very different. Not only did Jack the Ripper operate in the 1800s, but the crime span for Jack the Ripper is very, very small. As I understand it, there were 5 confirmed Ripper victims, the canonical crimes, right? And that is beginning with the murder of Polly Nichols on August 31st of 1888, and then the second victim was Annie Chapman, and then there's the double event where 2 women were murdered in one night, and those were the murders of Long Liz Stride and of Catherine Eddowes, and then the final confirmed victim on November 9th of 1888 was Mary Kelly. So August 31st to 1888, that is a very short time frame. I mean, that is also very abnormal with serial killers. The Long Island serial killer is a little bit more difficult to place. While some people think Jack the Ripper was operating well before 1888, and that somebody just decided to write letters taking credit for the murders because they wanted to attribute the concept of the Ripper or the concept of Saucy Jackie to this particular crime wave. Like, imagine a serial killer is operating and then just wants to send several taunting messages to the authorities, but he's actually operating well before August 31st of 1888, well after November 9th of 1888. It's just doing this taunting gesture for a very short amount of time. With the Long Island serial killer, we aren't completely sure when the murders began and when they ended. However, some people believe the Long Island serial killer was operating as early as 1996. Some people think it's even before, but let's just say 1996 for the sake of this discussion, and then continuing well into the new millennium, well into the second decade of the new millennium. The early years 2010, possibly 2011. Really, it's about, by that point, we have seen some major changes in the behavior of the Long Island serial killer, because the Long Island serial killer started out by doing some very physical activities with the bodies of the victims. Here's a very strong comparison. Jack the Ripper and the Long Island serial killer both primarily targeted sex workers. They both primarily mutilated the bodies of the victims. However, an interesting commonality is, while they mutilated many of the victims, they both have instances where they did not mutilate the female's body. For example, with Jack the Ripper, there was that double event that I was talking about where two women were murdered in one night, the murders of Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes. With Liz Stride, she is the Ripper's victim in the canonical crimes who was not mutilated. And there was a postcard that was mailed after that saying that the first one squealed a bit so Jack couldn't do his thing. And then sometime, in some estimates, they say it's within 15 minutes he had located the next victim, Catherine Eddowes. I am horribly suspicious and I'm very skeptical of that story, and that he murdered Catherine Eddowes, and not only that, but also mutilated her. But Long Liz Stride was slashed across the throat, and she, other than that, her body was not mutilated, torn to shreds, like some of the other Ripper victims, having like the abdominal section more or less completely cut apart and so on. So, the Long Island serial killer is one that is doing that to some victims. In the clearest examples of the Long Island serial killer, it is with the murders of Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack. For years, Valerie Mack was known as Jane Doe number 6 until she was identified using DNA. But their bodies were cut apart, mutilated, and discarded. And there was also a tattoo on Jessica Taylor's body that was cut to shreds. And this is all occurring in the early part of the new millennium, and well past 2000, but definitely before 2005, in the early years of the new millennium. Because, as I said, the Long Island serial killer would operate over a span of around 15 years, give or take. And I don't really mean to put any number on the Long Island serial killer's activities, because, as I said, until the killer is identified, we do not know. But the authorities began to suspect very early on that there was a serial killer on the loose in Long Island targeting sex workers, and at the time the media was referring to this person as the Manorville Butcher because the bodies were discarded, and the authorities believed that Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack were linked together by the same killer. I'm not someone who completely doubts the authorities or saying, oh no, they're just being skeptical, they want the real killer to come into the public eye. They're trying to bait the real killer into doing something. No, if they say they are confirmed victims, I accept that until proven otherwise. But near the end of the Long Island serial killer activities, we had the suspicious death of Shannon Gilbert. And Shannon Gilbert was a woman whom they thought was a victim of the Long Island serial killer. She had a very bizarre episode in the home of a man named Joe Brewer, and she was driven there by her driver Michael Pack, and to be an escort to Joe Brewer, and something happened. Something either set Shannon off, maybe it was drug-related, maybe it was just a manic episode, maybe it was something else, and she was actually in fear for her life, and then she ran out. She's banging on doors in the neighborhoods saying, help, they are trying to kill me. And, I mean, it's possible that they called a doctor before they called the police, and that doctor's name was Peter Hackett, and whatever happened to Shannon, we don't completely know, but she disappeared, ran off into the marshy area of Long Island, and she was never seen alive again. Her remains were discovered. However, the authorities do not believe that she was a victim of the Long Island serial killer. Yet, because of the search for Shannon Gilbert, they discovered 4 bodies that had been placed into a burlap, and that they had been discarded. Like, I put the word buried in one of my episodes. I think that was the Long Island serial killer, all questions answered. And somebody said they weren't buried, but discarded was perhaps a better word for it. And no matter what, there are 4 bodies that were found, and they were since known as the Gilgo Four, named for Gilgo Beach, but they were not mutilated. So we see that while the mutilation appears to be Jack the Ripper's primary objective, he wasn't able to do it every time. And this is a point with Jack the Ripper that I insist so frequently, that it's not about the murders. No matter what your theory is with Jack the Ripper, it's not about the murders. It's about the mutilations. If that is true about what happened with Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes, I mean, Jack the Ripper could have just taken credit for the murder and said that, oh, yeah, I wasn't able to do my thing, but I killed her. No. Jack the Ripper wanted to mutilate the body of a woman. With the Long Island serial killer, it appears to be something quite different. It actually appears that whoever is doing this is trying to hide the evidence, like trying to destroy things about the women's bodies that is either going to delay an investigation or is going to cause trouble for identification, or perhaps just confuse the authorities and law enforcement. And that doesn't seem to be Jack the Ripper's primary objective. Jack the Ripper seems to be doing something a little bit different. Now, because this is the psychological breakdown episode, when I was watching Dr. Todd Grande's presentation on the Long Island serial killer, he said something that I thought was very, very enthralling, and that is that the Long Island serial killer was average in neuroticism. I thought he was going to say low in neuroticism because he says that frequently about other serial killers, but he said the Long Island serial killer was average in neuroticism, like worrying. Like, okay, he's not going to be extremely low when it comes to worrying, not worrying about anything at all. With whoever is doing this in Jack the Ripper's case, I think that the Ripper would be very low in neuroticism. I mean, not to the point where he's going to try and mutilate Liz Stride's body in front of witnesses and get captured. We should always remember that serial killers have heightened predatory instincts, and that leads them just to the ability to commit crimes without getting caught. Okay, I mean, maybe he's just not worrying about a lot of things. It doesn't mean that he was stupid. So, with the Long Island serial killer, average in neuroticism is an appropriate description. He is worrying about things to a certain extent because of all the effort that has gone in covering up the bodies, whether it's mutilations or trying to conceal and hide and discard the human remains. Now, this also leads us to the theories. And in terms of psychology, I know some people are not going to like this, but I think all of the differences, all the inconsistencies, and the time frame of Jack the Ripper suggests that the Ripper hoax theory is rather plausible. The Ripper hoax theory is the idea that there was this publication in London called The Star, and that they fabricated the letters in an attempt to create, well, fake news, this media story about how there's this evil serial killer who is out on the loose, and he is targeting sex workers, he's cutting up women's bodies, when in reality these women are being murdered. I mean, real murders did happen, but they were committed by the London street gangs. They would try to blackmail people who were in vulnerable places, like sex workers who were somewhat out of their prime, and then when they refused or that they were unable to, their bodies were torn to shreds, and maybe several people knew about this in the London underworld, that this practice is going on, but the Star put out the idea that there is Jack the Ripper, and that the Ripper's definitely going to strike again. It was about creating a media panic or drawing attention to sell newspapers and to save this particular publication. Some of the evidence that supports the Ripper hoax theory is that there has been an alleged confession from someone named Fred Best, which occurred in the 1930s, that he fabricated the Dear Boss letter, perhaps one of the most famous Jack the Ripper pieces of writing, and the Saucy Jack postcard, which I referenced previously, talking about the double event. And then there was the From Hell letter, I suppose, which is perhaps the most famous Jack the Ripper composition. And if you look at the handwriting of the Dear Boss letter and the From Hell letter, I think that they are drastically different, but not only that, they're intentionally different. I'm not completely sold on this Ripper hoax theory. The honest answer is I do not know. But when you look at the differences, just look at that time frame. August 31st to November 9th of 1888. I think that that is something that is horribly abnormal for serial killers. Normally, a serial killer isn't only going to be operating for 2.5 months. I mean, we have numerous examples of this throughout history. Most notably, the Phantom Killer in 1946 in Texarkana did something like that, not in the summer and the fall like Jack the Ripper, but the Phantom Killer operated in the winter and the spring of 1946, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. But then there's also the Zodiac Killer, which has a very short time frame. The canonical Zodiac crimes also fit in less than 1 year. They were done over a period of about 10 months, from 1968 to 1969, December 20th of 68 to October 11th of 1969, and they only occur in the summer and the fall. So then that also raises the question about what really is going on with these crimes. And there's some people out there who just think that these are all media hoaxes, that these are all just the example of someone writing letters taking credit for crimes that they did not commit. Now, with the Ripper hoax, I mean, like I said, some people are really going to disagree with this, but I think that there is a lot of pointing toward the possibility that somebody actually did that, writing letters taking credit for crimes that they did not commit. With the Zodiac hoax, there are a lot more complications. However, I would like to go to a particular piece of writing about Jack the Ripper, and this is from none other than jacktheripper.org, talking about the murder of Mary Kelly. And it begins with, "A cry for murder. At around 4 a.m. on the morning of the 9th of November, 2 neighbors claimed that they heard a faint cry of, 'Oh, murder!' But cries of murder were quite a regular occurrence in the neighborhood, and often meant a drunken brawl was taking place or domestic violence was occurring. It was quite customary for those on the receiving end of such violence to scream, 'Murder!' The local residents didn't want to get involved, and so they would ignore any such cries, as indeed the 2 neighbors of Mary Kelly ignored the cry that they heard. Thomas Bowyer finds her body," maybe it's pronounced Bowyer, it's probably pronounced Bowyer, "at 10:45 a.m. the morning Mary Kelly's landlord John McCarthy sent his assistant Thomas Bowyer, who was also known as Indian Harry, that's easier for me to pronounce, round to 13 Miller's Court to collect her overdue rent. Striding into Miller's Court, Indian Harry banged twice on the door. There was no answer. No doubt, believing that she was inside, but unwilling and unable to pay the rent, Bowyer stepped around the corner and pulled aside a curtain from the broken window pane. Moments later, an ashen-faced Bowyer staggered back into McCarthy's shop. 'Governor,' he spluttered. 'I knocked at the door and I could not get anyone to answer. I looked through the window and saw a lot of blood.' 'You don't mean that, Harry,' was McCarthy's horrified response, and the 2 men hurried from the shop into Miller's Court. Stooping down, McCarthy pushed aside the curtain and gazed into the gloomy room. A sight of unimaginable horror met his eyes. The wall behind the bed was spattered with blood. On the bedside table was a pile of bloody human flesh, and there on the bed, barely recognizable as human, lay the virtually skinned cadaver of Mary Kelly." This is something that I think is extremely different than the Long Island serial killer. I mean, you want to talk about neuroticism and worrying? It seems that the Ripper, whoever committed the murder of Mary Kelly, hoax theory, multiple participants theory, single Jack the Ripper theory, no matter what theory you're going with, whoever committed the murder of Mary Kelly was not concerned about leaving evidence behind, and if anything, created more evidence. Have you guys ever watched an episode of Forensic Files? When people do things to crime scenes, they create more evidence. By things, I mean any type of action. If someone tries to burn a building down in an arson attempt, arson leaves more evidence than it destroys. If someone is trying to poison somebody, then they're leaving behind the evidence directly in the person's body. I have a whole episode about that on the channel called All the Poisoning Murders on Forensic Files. And if somebody is going to mutilate someone's body and leave them behind in the room, that is leaving all of the physical evidence behind, or leaving behind a large amount of physical evidence. Not all, but a large amount of it, and leaving all kinds of clues. And here's a point that I think is very different with the Long Island serial killer. A victim was not found indoors, to the best of my knowledge, but going through the list of Long Island serial killer victims, I haven't encountered one that has been found inside their own place of residence, let alone inside any building, as I talked about, mutilated and discarded, or perhaps hidden in somewhat of a concealed way, put inside burlap sacks. It seems that the Long Island serial killer is trying to hide evidence, but not very well. Not very well, mind you. And that's why I think it perhaps is rather average in terms of this worrying component. But I do have one final note about the Ripper hoax theory, and that is that the idea that there is just this brilliant person who has medical knowledge and is going around London murdering women who are in vulnerable places at night is challenged by people in, for example, in the book, The Mammoth Book of Jack the Ripper. It talks about how people don't normally perform surgery in back alleyways, outdoors, at 4 o'clock in the morning, maybe sometimes, later, like 2, or earlier rather, 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., in total darkness. And in a back alley, there wouldn't even be street lamps. So perhaps there is a certain amount of mythos surrounding this about how there is this type of brilliant medical criminal who is attacking women in vulnerable places, and instead the crimes are actually happening in a much more brutish and uncalculated manner. So that really gets me thinking. I mean, I do agree with that. Any type of masterful surgical work would be nearly impossible in those conditions. So perhaps over the years, some people have added on layers of thinking. With the Long Island serial killer, you're not going to find those types of theories. The Long Island serial killer hoax? No, I don't think so. There is a phone call that has been made connected to the Long Island serial killer, but that doesn't necessarily mean that someone is trying to be some type of braggadocio. Instead, a big theory with the Lisk is there is a type of snuff ring going on. People always say snuff films, but some of you guys in the comment section have just said a snuff ring. That you believe that there is this type of affluent community, Gilgo Beach, as well as the other communities on Long Island, where there are lots of wealthy people. Some of them perhaps even have political power. Perhaps other people could even be connected to law enforcement. And they're using their power to cover up a series of murders, maybe like a thrill kill club, but it doesn't mean that there are any type of videotapes out there. It doesn't mean there's any type of videotaping going on. Not snuff films, but a snuff ring where women are being murdered by people in somewhat of a quasi-elite circle, and then there's this type of fixer, or there's this type of close confidant of the elite circle that is discarding of the bodies. And I do not like these theories in anything. I do not like these theories in the Ripper case or the Zodiac Killer case, or in any sort of true crime mystery, even the stuff about the Manson family, that's what's going on. However, with the Long Island serial killer, I'm having a tough time finding an alternative, because if you look at the Long Island serial killer, it's also been referred to as the murders committed by the Craigslist Ripper. So many of them have been escorts or sex workers, whatever label you'd like to use, who have been using the internet to advertise their services. Most of them had connections to New York City. Then they're then transported from New York City to Long Island and never seen alive again. Yet, if this were a single person, perhaps more evidence would have been uncovered, or maybe the authorities have some things that they aren't willing to share. We always have to remember they did catch the Golden State Killer. They did go through a decades-long manhunt for someone, and some people are like, no, there's no way that it's a single person. It's a group of people doing all this, and it turns out that it's mostly just one person. Yes, he may have had some aiding and assistance from certain people who I won't get into now, but yeah, one person can do horrible things. So I noticed that that is just a very big difference with Jack the Ripper. This idea that it is because of anything to do with technology. All that stuff didn't exist at the time, whether it's the snuff films. Although, come to think of it, there is the first episode of Ripper Street. I only watched 2 episodes of that show. I saw Ripper Street on Netflix. I think it might still be up there. And in the first episode, they talk about the creation of the moving pictures and so on. But about the Long Island serial killer, many of the victims were estimated to have been about 4 feet 11 inches tall. Many of them, as we said, were working in sex work. One of them was a male, and I want to be very careful with my words, but a male who was dressing as a female. There was also a baby that was murdered who has simply been referred to as Baby Jane Doe. And there are, I think, 2 very large theories about that. Firstly, that Baby Jane Doe was simply with her mother at the time of the murder, and then, well, you couldn't leave any type of witness, even a baby, or that was just the practical solution for the serial killer, as gruesome as it sounds. And the second is that Baby Jane Doe was discarded in a place which was very close to I believe it was the body of Valerie Mack, and that someone was suggesting that there were multiple perpetrators who were operating for this snuff ring. By them, I mean the fixers. There's this whole community of men who is luring prostitutes from New York City to Long Island, having them murdered as part of some type of thrill kill club, and then they have somebody discard the bodies. And that there was actually, by chance, someone discarded Baby Jane Doe's body about 600 meters from Valerie Mack's body, but don't quote me on that distance. I'll have to double check that, but it's somewhat of within the nearby range, depending on your definition. When you think about so many of the victims being the same height, so many of the victims working a similar occupation, there are single serial killers who do go out and behave that way. And this isn't even so much about the Long Island serial killer versus Jack the Ripper. It's more about how there is a single perpetrator theory. And I'm not like endorsing anybody's theory right now. I just wanted to point out that whether it's Jack the Ripper or the Long Island serial killer, the lone wolf, disgruntled individual, murderous mind could be at play. I mean, it's definitely possible. Now, with the Long Island serial killer, the fact that so many victims are the same height and so many of them are just petite women, and that many of the victims were mutilated, I'm reminded of the serial killer Ted Bundy and his desire to go after women who had a very particular look, who looked like an ex-lover that he had. And I think it's in the Stranger Beside Me, wherein she says, she looks like me and she looks like me. They all look like me. Where someone has a very particular mindset. Maybe it's not even an ex-lover. Maybe they hated their mother and they went after women who had a body type like their mother. So I'm just guessing at that point. That is just simply somewhat of an educated guess, mind you, but that is guesswork all the same about the Long Island serial killer. Because you'd have to wonder, if there is this type of snuff ring going on, this thrill kill club, why do all the victims have to be small, petite women? I mean, if there's a group of people, are they all going to have that same type of lousy experience with their mother? I mean, okay, I take that back, yes. But are they all going to go after women who look the same? I mean, what I was really trying to get at is, I mean, if it's just about going after someone who had the image of your mother, then there should be different types of body types. There should be someone who's 6 feet tall and then someone who is 5 feet tall. I'm just guessing. I mean, that was something that would make sense to me. However, I do want to reinforce the point that with the Long Island serial killer, murder does seem to play a much larger role in the killer's activities, as opposed to Jack the Ripper, whom I said was primarily about the mutilations. The Long Island serial killer is also not openly bragging and flaunting his exploits out for the newspapers to see. Now, maybe going out on a limb too much here, but Jack the Ripper did something that many serial killers would do after him. But no matter what theory you're entertaining, and that is creating a three-way relationship with the media, law enforcement, and the killer. Now, some people would do this on overdrive. The Zodiac Killer, for example, writing letters talking about the victims and mailing them to the newspapers, but then also calling out certain detectives and investigators by name, also trying to get in touch with the attorney Melvin Belli. So there's a three-way relationship among law enforcement, the media, and the killer. With the Long Island serial killer, I'm not really seeing that type of behavior. What I'm not seeing is this overwhelming desire for attention, or the overwhelming desire for people to hear some type of message, or just someone just to flaunt their horrible, horrible crimes to the world, and to just do the flaunt and flout, where they're showing the crimes to the world, and they're also having this open disregard and bragging about ignoring the law. The Long Island serial killer, I'm not seeing that. It really seems like someone is trying to discard the bodies in a confusing way. Now, the fact that some of the victims were mutilated, that may suggest an enormous amount of rage that was being unleashed by a single perpetrator, perhaps in his late 20s to early 30s. And by the time you get to the Gilgo 4, you have someone who has gotten older, a decline in testosterone, which would suggest that they either did not have the energy to commit the mutilations or did not want to bother, and after that point, they simply did not want to continue. But it's all unsolved. It's all unsolved. What do you think about Jack the Ripper and the Long Island serial killer? What do you believe that their actions suggest? What do you think about the Ripper hoax theory that I talked about? And as of now, I've never heard of a Long Island serial killer hoax theory, because as I said, that can be another challenge question in itself. What do you think about the observation that the Long Island serial killer is primarily about covering up a series of murders that took place, whereas the Ripper is more about mutilating the bodies, and then the secondary purpose would be writing the letters, like the Dear Boss letter, the From Hell letter, and so on. If you have anything to share, please put your ideas down in the comment section down below. And if there's any topic that you would like covered on the Versus series, maybe you'd like to hear a comparing and contrasting between two different serial killers or two different criminals, please put your ideas in the comment section, and I will try to get them to them on Thursdays over the course of the next several months. That's all for me now. I will see you over on Instagram for the bonus podcast, but first, anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com, and on the Instagram as well, BlackBoxNet88, and I'll be over there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.